So today we are honored and excited to be joined with Dr. John Romano to discuss the ways in which medieval people traveled in the medieval era and the concept of religious pilgrimage. Dr. Romano has been a member of the Department of History at Benedictine College since 2010 and is the chair of History and Social Sciences since 2013. Dr. Romano, thank you so much for joining with us.
Happy to be here.
So I figured we'd just dive into it and just ask maybe some broad questions. How did the medieval people feel about travel? Was there any sort of suspicion of travel or travelers?
Travel, it was difficult. It was burdensome. You could come to a good end through travel, but the process itself was often dangerous. So you might be getting something out of it financially. You might be getting something out of it spiritually, but you recognize it was not going to be fun doing it.
And if I can follow up, then what were the reasons medieval people traveled? What sort of classes of people were prone to travel? Because I understand that perhaps the nobility and merchant classes could probably afford to travel, but what about maybe the peasant classes or mendicant friars?
Well, I mean, when you certainly when you come to something like merchants, their job was based upon travel. They had absolutely no choice but to travel, they were not exempted, of course, from all the terrors of travel. And we have all sorts of accounts of merchants losing all of their wares and shipwrecks and things like this. So, I mean, even though they had to do it, it was no more pleasant for them. As you said too, I mean, the nobility certainly traveled, and even especially in the early Middle Ages, the whole political system was often based upon travel because in many cases, kings and other smaller lords, their courts would be mobile. And so in essence, they would force their followers to come to them to provide counsel or to aid them in war. So they had no choice but to travel. The further you go down on the class system, people tended to travel less, but it's erroneous to think, as people often used to, that peasants didn't travel at all, or they were completely rooted in the ground. They couldn't move from it. Especially when it comes to pilgrimage, we do think that there were plenty of peasants who took part in pilgrimage in some way or shape or form. And it doesn't necessarily mean the great pilgrimage centers you might think of, like Rome or something like that. Even relatively local pilgrimage centers people could go to. And in other cases, too, even people lower down the social ladder, in some cases, they'd be called to fight in wars, and so they would also have to travel. So there's another good reason to travel.
Sure. So it seems like that travel was typically undertaken for, depending upon where you fell in the caste, so to speak. It was undertaken for maybe political reasons or financial reasons, and there's also this element of going on undertaking travel for religious reasons. Would any of those reasons ever at all mesh together? Like was there ever more than one motive for undertaking travel?
Yeah, absolutely. We get the sense that one very good example is this ambassador for the Mongols known as a Sauma, who travels from Baghdad to Western Europe. His mission is he is a diplomat, and he's trying to get Western European leaders to drum up support for a crusade against Muslims, and Mongols would also fight against Muslims on the other end. His mission is a complete failure. No one actually comes to join in this crusade, but while he's in the city of Rome, he says to the Pope, "Hey, well, since I'm here, can you take me to all the holy spots in the city, show me your relics, show me your worship?" And so he ends up having this religious experience, even though that is not the Mongols were not funding him to go out and to have a pilgrimage. But in effect, that's what happens.
Sure. And as I understand it, pilgrimage could also sort of have this almost, in addition to religious, sort of like recreational aspect to it. Like when one pilgrim and businesswoman that I have in mind is Marjorie Kemp, and while she's very clear she's very clear that she's undertaking her various pilgrimages for religious reasons. She also wants to do this for recreational reasons. At least I think a case could be argued. Like she takes out her measurer and measures tombs. She tries to collect her own relics and bring them back to England.
And I think there absolutely are people that I think they're very poorly represented in our sources in some ways. People who just went on pilgrimage because they really wanted to have a good time, to see someplace else, to mix with other people. They were definitely there. We tend to hear more about the most religious souls possible, who have these pilgrimages that are a little bit more life changing, perhaps. But if you read something like the Canterbury Tales, you can see that not everyone is in it at the same level of religiosity. There are people who clearly are also enjoying themselves along the way. And that doesn't preclude that they had some sort of religious experience, but it may not have been the main goal for everybody going on these pilgrimages.
Gotcha. Well, if I can then follow up, what were some of the challenges medieval people would have experienced when traveling that maybe we in a contemporary society don't necessarily have to worry about?
The roads would have been terrible for a good portion of the Middle Ages. In the early medieval period, in most places in Western Europe, people are still on Roman roads. And as time advances, these begin to break down entirely. And the degree to which they are fixed depends upon local initiative. And in some cases, they're not fixed at all. And so, in effect, you're traveling on absolutely awful roads. You're traveling, largely speaking, on foot, the majority of people, which limits how far you can really travel in a day. I think sometimes the people make the estimate of around 20 miles was a normal day. Even that may have been ambitious in some cases. If you had a cart with you or something, or you had a mixed group where you have a lot of older people going on pilgrimage, you may not even make it 20 miles in a day.
Sure.
Then, of course, you move from just annoyances into things like the complete dangers, like shipwrecks, clearly a lot of people also lose all their goods through robbery as well. So that there's a good chance, maybe not as much for pilgrims, but certainly for merchants. A lot of these merchants who do travel long distances, everyone knows that they have goods that are portable, are small, and extremely expensive, or you would never travel that distance with them. So they were a mark. I mean, everyone knew that it was going after them.
Sure.
So you might lose all your goods and your life, and additionally, if you're in the wrong circumstance.
Right. And more in particular for women undertaking travel, were there any particular dangers that concerned women when embarking on travel? Like, to circle back to Marjorie, I know that she sort of emphasizes her worry about being robbed and molested while on pilgrimages.
Yeah, and it would have been unusual for anyone to travel alone. I mean, the very few cases we have which someone travels alone in a very small group. It strikes people as being bizarre, but you would never have a woman traveling alone. It would have been virtually unthinkable, exactly because of these dangers, especially again, the danger of rape was clearly omnipresent. So it would have been unthinkable for a woman to travel alone. And so you point to Marjorie Kemp, I mean, at least one of the dangers in the fact that she gets along so poorly with other people she goes on pilgrimages to the Holy Land is that she's going to be left all alone, and nothing good can come of that. I mean, in addition to just the fact that she's upset about the fact that people don't like her, I mean, there's actually even a greater danger to her.
Right. And with respect to pilgrimage, or I guess you could say travel bans and groups, would these be typically comprised of folks that you might know, or are you sort of just bound on this common journey and destination, and whoever you end up with, you end up with. Was it at all common to prepare an expedition or travel with people that you know that might also be interested in making the journey, or were you sort of just dealt a hand of cards and you just have to deal with the folks that you have to deal with?
Usually, it seems to be that people would have known one another ahead of time. But as you get closer to these sites, then you do get people sort of coming together in larger groups, or just seeking out others who are going to the same place, because numbers can only improve your safety ultimately. And so there's a rule that merchants can live by, but also pilgrims, that the greater numbers you have, the odds are that it'll be safer for you too. So if you find someone going to the same place, and especially also if you're booking a ship fare or something, it's easier to do as a group, as a larger group.
Sure. And would language and coming across different languages have at all been a stumbling block for travelers? I suppose if you're a merchant, you're sort of used to uh, making trades and so forth with other languages and cultures, but what typically would have been a way for medievals to deal with that stumbling block? Were they just more used to encountering different languages, or how did they resolve
Uh,
that?
so yeah, as you said, with merchants, especially you think about Marco Polo or people from that time period. Many of the merchants who traveled into the east would learn Persian, and it became like the lingua franca of many of these people who are trading in Mongol territory in China. Foreign merchants would all speak to one another in Persian, not in any of the local languages. When it comes to the people traveling in Western Europe, we do have a few phrase books left over, which in some cases are so idiosyncratic. We really find it hard to believe that they certainly were systematic enough to actually provide you with anything you wanted to say at any given
Sure.
time. Um, we would probably think that people may do more or less. They travel to these other places. I mean, and in some cases, what that means is that, I mean, they probably it would be very difficult to actually converse with anyone in the places you went to. So now
Sure.
you could depend upon people. I mean, at least in some cases, in some of the probably the more famous sites, you probably had people on hand who could actually help you with different places in Europe. But in some cases, you'd be on your own. Or,
Sure.
uh, or, or if you were, I mean, if you were someone who traveled regularly, like a merchant, you could make it, you could actually begin to learn a little bit of the local language to be able to get what you needed. There's also the very strange phenomenon in the later medieval period that in some cases, merchants who traveled within Western Europe, Latin actually is used. It's very sort of a limited sort of set of Latin vocabulary is used among merchants. That again, whatever gets the job done. But
Right.
you can see the problem of not having, as we do today, something like English, which has become so dominant as a second language for so many people. There really is nothing exactly like that in the medieval period. And even Latin, which is the universal language of the church, didn't help the vast majority of people all that much. And
Sure. That makes
even
sense.
people who speak Romance languages, I mean, you may be able to figure out some Latin, but it's always a question: at what point does that become totally impossible for people? And usually,
Sure.
most people say by the 10th century, just speaking Latin is not going to help most of the people who speak Romance languages these days.
Sure. And then if I can ask maybe a closing remark on sort of travel in general, and then maybe we could discuss the concept of travel literature and travel guides. Was it at all common to for travelers to write a will or make provisions before traveling, given the dangers that they might have experienced?
It's a very interesting question that you posed. As so far as I know, no one has studied it intensively. We certainly, I mean, uh, there are people who have definitely studied wills, and generally speaking, people who actually had money would make wills, especially as the Middle Ages go on, our preservation rates get much higher. In some cases, it probably involved travel, but we do know of cases too, other dangerous activities like entering into war, in which people definitely wrote out wills, or in some cases too, would take final communion and everything before they actually set out on journeys, with the thought that they may not make it back.
Sure.
And we know, at least in some cases too, I think about crusading, for instance, as just one particular instance of travel in which we know at least some cases in which people may actually made vows that they would not return. Okay. So in fact, they got all their affairs in order before they started out on travel, with the presumption that either they would die in battle or they'd just live out the rest of their lives elsewhere. Now it's a rather particular case, but it did happen sometimes.
All right, then if I can ask, what was the purpose of travel guides and travel literature in the Middle Ages? Are travel guides at all similar to sort of tourist guides that we have today?
We do have there was no real it's an interesting question, because we have a genre on the shelf that is travel literature. In the Middle Ages, nothing of the kind existed. It is modern scholars trying to impose our categories on what they have. So there's a lot of things that I would consider travel literature that look a lot like our idea of a travel literature, but they wouldn't necessarily have put them on that shelf.
Sure.
So usually scholars take a very broad attitude to what travel literature in the Middle Ages, anything that deals substantially with travel, but that also means that many things that we would not necessarily think are travel literature, just things that essentially a long list of things that doesn't look like really much of a what we would think is like a literary sort of product, or also travel literature perhaps. We do know, to give you just one example of a travel guide, clearly these did exist in some places, actual guides to tell you this is what you should see. Probably for the early medieval period, the most famous example I can think of is called the Einsiedlung Itinerary, which is this list of places that you have to see in Rome. The way that it is mapped out, you can actually, I've actually done this in person, in places in Rome, you can actually go from place to place in the city of Rome, and it tells you what you should be looking at your left, right, and what you should be looking at your left. It's a very interesting mixture, because sometimes people think that people only travel for religious reasons, but this guide will have both. Here's a church that you have to see and the relics in it, but here is a pillar from the ancient world that you also have to see, or here's another sort of classical building, or here's a cypress tree. It's an interesting it's a thing that you might want to see anyway. In that case, it actually appears like a checklist. In other cases, we have people writing things with the hope, seemingly, that others will follow in their path, especially seemingly to the Holy Land. We have several examples in which, here are all the sites you have to see. You know the Bible, who actually want to see these things in person. You have to see, this is the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre. This is you have to go see, this site, which you'll remember in the Bible. And so in essence, it is meant to both guide you, but to try to whet your appetite to go see these things, I think.
And then we're travel guides, you might say, and I know we're using this term broadly. Were they at all written to motivate travel as well as to guide current travelers? One of the interesting parts about accounts of travel is that you really get themes of like the exotic and all these sort of crazy accounts of like monstrous beasts and peculiar land formations. Would this, a person who's reading, if they could afford to read, if they could have read this or that travel account, would they have been motivated maybe to travel to those places in addition to have already have traveled to such and such?
No, yeah, I think so. It's hard to prove it with any certainty, but I do think that um, especially when you're talking about some of these great products of the East, where you get these descriptions of all these wonderful things that you can, all these spices, these things you can trade for. These kind of things must have motivated some merchants to go out and check it for themselves. And the kind of things that you're talking about, these, especially these exotic sort of monstrous people, or not even people, monsters who lived in the East. We have more than one account. One I think of as this Mendicant friar, William of Rubruck, who actually asked people, have you seen any of these people? I understand that there are people who have dog heads on people's bodies. And everyone he talks to says, no, we've never seen those things. But the fact is, he was asking about them, which tells us that just reading about that did compel him to want to go see them for himself.
Right.
And as I mentioned too, as I said, on a religious level, I do think that having all of these accounts of what is there to see and how you can experience these holy sites, I think does compel people to travel, especially to the Holy Land, which is more of a difficult endeavor than just staying in Western Europe. We know, for instance, in the early medieval period, there used to be this argument amongst even theologians that you don't have to go to the Holy Land. Isn't God everywhere? Can't you just worship God anywhere you are? But the more that people go, the more that people write these things, the more that people talk about it, then there's this curiosity. And then you get this form of piety where it's like, it's not enough to just sit at home and read about this. You have to walk with your feet in the same place where Jesus walked. And that really begins to capture people's imagination, I think.
Sure. And then if I can ask another question about maybe travel guides, would I guess in our sort of contemporary day and age, we kind of just rely on our I guess you might call them expert at guides to sort of navigate our way through a new country we might be visiting, or a new place or town. But would travelers try and craft their own travel guides and accounts while on travel? Like, would they try to, in a given account where they visit, also try to craft like a guide for anyone else who might want to read what they've written?
It's an interesting question, because it seems to us that the vast majority of travelers, medieval travelers, they'll only write what they experience long after the travel, or at least after they've completed the travel. And you can see this sometimes in the imprecision of the way that they relate to certain things or certain places where it doesn't make much sense to us geographically, but it would make sense if you sat down several years afterwards, to try your best to figure it out. There are some cases, and it may be more so for East Asian travelers, where they actually will have diaries in which they'll be writing from day to day. One famous example, for instance, is this Japanese monk who travels to China called Enin. And he actually has a diary in which day to day he says, sometimes the entries are horribly boring, and that, I just got stung by mosquitoes today. You wonder, like, why did you record this? But it's a diary, so you need something for every day practically. So whereas in many cases, it's just what stood out most to the travelers long after the fact that they'll sit down and write about.
Right. And I also remember reading how sometimes the pilgrims or the travelers' internal psychological state, they'll sort of jot that down in their notes. Like I remember reading Ibn Fadlan, and how he gives an account of how, like, he's feeling homesick and lonely, and this feeling of loneliness while on travel. Do we get any sort of like psychological insights in travelers through their writings? Or
Yeah, sometimes I think every so often you get the personality actually shining through. And it was someone you mentioned, like Marjorie Kemp. Feels to us like an individual. There are many other cases, though, in which, and I know that sometimes a frustration for students with whom I read these accounts, that they don't always seem like people, and the kind of goals that we may have in for modern travel literature, that I go on this journey and somehow it changes me as a person. Like I come back, in some way bettered by the experience. In some cases, you just search in vain for
Right.
any sense that they're changing as a person. That in some cases, it seems that yes, they're telling us a story, but we don't always know what effect it has on them, or how if indeed it is changing them as a person. It may well have, but it just may be that they're not writing for the modern genre of travel literature, in which that's almost an expectation.
Right. Right. All right then. Well, I figured we could then maybe shift again to discussing another topic that's related to travel. Uh, Obviously, in the medieval era, we get all these travel narratives and sort of travel stories, and a famous example is, of course, Canterbury Tales, which we'll get to. But one of the works I wanted to discuss was this work called The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. Uh, what are the travels of John Mandeville? What insights does it provide into the medieval concept of travel?
So the Travels of Sir John Mandeville was this extremely popular, just by in terms of manuscripts and in early printed books, travelogue that is and written by. There's a lot of debates about exactly who wrote it. The name John Mandeville was this name that basically he pulled out of a hat as a pseudonym, and so far it's someone who didn't actually travel anywhere himself. One critic said that his longest travel was probably to the local library, and he stitches together all of these different real travel accounts to create this sort of mishmash of a travel that he really tends to stress a lot of these very sort of exotic or exaggerated things that are supposedly out there somewhere in the East. And so it was, even though sometimes modern readers have no idea what to do with it, medieval readers love this thing, clearly. And I mean, it certainly scratched that itch when it comes to talking about what do exotic peoples do. And, so like, for instance, exotic peoples, I'm using this term that just lumps together all sorts of people beyond the Western world. They go around naked, or they worship idols, or they engage in all these sort of sexual practices, which would have been like wife swapping, that would have been abhorrent to people in Western Europe. But clearly there's this fascination with them, though, or these work would not have proliferated. Or as we said earlier, all these monstrous peoples are one of the most popular parts of John Mandeville. Again, none of this material was original to him, but he set it out. All of the people who have, for instance, who don't have heads, they have their chest is where their eyes appear, the blemi, or this other host of people who have all these sort of irregular sort of body types all appear in John Mandeville.
Now, if I could ask, did medieval peoples take these exotic accounts at their face value? I mean, I know you talked about William of Rubric and how he seems genuinely curious about, okay, are these monstrous creatures actually here? Are they local to this place? But did medieval peoples take these accounts as true, or did they take them as myth, or some sort of mixture of both? What would you say to that?
Probably, I would probably go with the mixture of both option. Probably some people were more skeptical than others, but I mean, the number of illustrations that we have of some of these monstrous people, for instance, makes us think that at very least people liked the idea of these things existing, and debates about whether or not these monstrous people could be saved as well. That makes us think that at least some people were thinking that they're out there somewhere. And there are people who do these things long outside of our customs, whether or not we'll actually personally be able to see them. I mean, a similar question people often ask with saints' lives. Like sometimes people will say, well, how could anyone have taken some of these things seriously? It's very clearly that some people did take these things at face value. And so is probably similar with the accounts, some of these very exotic accounts, that there are at least some people who felt that this corresponded to the truth.
Sure. All right, then if I can ask another question. Well, it's a fictional work. Does Chaucer's Canterbury Tales reveal any important insights into travel and pilgrimage in the medieval era?
I think it does. I think that it gives us a very good sense of perhaps a much obviously most normal pilgrims are not going to be busting out these wonderful stories or I said this level of quality, but it does give you some sense, I think, of what a real pilgrimage would have been like, and just this sort of ragtag group of people going together, and in this case to Thomas Becket's grave, which in England was enormously popular. So perhaps gives you just a slice of life of what it would have been like, even though they're not real people. I mean, and especially considering that not just with pilgrimage, but all medieval travel. I mean, we really have just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the number of people who travel versus the number of people who actually produced any kind of source that we can read now. So uh, we'll take everyone we can get in this category, even if it's fictional. It gives us some idea of how this actually worked, I think.
Right, right. And then what were some popular pilgrimage sites in the Middle Ages? I mean, certainly we talked about the Holy Land was high on the list, but were there any other popular pilgrimage sites for the diverse religions? Or I, I know how you also mentioned how sometimes a pilgrimage could be local, it could be to a different country or to a different continent. But what would be some popular pilgrimage sites in the Middle Ages?
I mean, the number one site would have been Mecca, in part because, unlike for Christianity, in which pilgrimage was something that you could do that was meritorious, it could provide some sort of spiritual benefit. Mecca was a requirement, one of the five pillars of Islam. So any Muslim who has the means should be taking the pilgrimage at least once in his lifetime. Uh, one of our most famous medieval pilgrims, Muslim pilgrims, Ibn Battuta, actually did it twice in his lifetime, but that probably was unusual. If you could manage to get your act together to do it once, it was hard enough.
Right.
But we assume that Mecca was packed, for large portions of when it was time to do the pilgrimage. In terms on Christian sites, I mean, outside of the Holy Land, Rome was number one in Western Europe by far. In part because the perception was that the Romans were very good at creating martyrs, which meant that their bodies were still in the city of Rome, which meant that the number of cult sites in Rome is huge, and both vary between people like the big guns like Peter and Paul, but in many cases these much smaller cult sites, so that um, pilgrim would have no lack of things to see while he or she was there. The other big one in Western Europe is Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain, which it really, in some ways, is a much more interesting story. Rome, I mean, it's almost predictable that Rome would become as popular as it did. As Spain becomes more and more incorporated into the Christian world, as the reconquest takes place, and people from France and then other places in Western Europe become more and more interested in Spain. And one of the main spots they go to is Santiago de Compostela, where supposedly miraculously the body of St. James had been transported. So people took pilgrimages there, sometimes starting all the way in France and then making their way up into the regions of Spain.
I think we've talked about all that I was hoping to talk about for this episode. Maybe for some closing remarks, what are some good secondary sources that you'd recommend for further reading or researching medieval travel and pilgrimage? Are there any primary sources that you'd recommend? I know that you have this wonderful anthology of primary sources that you've
Yes,
made.
that was the number one I was going to say. Look at my own book, Medieval Travel and Travelers. If you're finished with that, Just in terms of primary material, I actually even did homework for this. Um, Put together some of my notes. There's a very good book called Medieval English Travel, a critical anthology, which has appeared recently. That is similar to my book, although more focused on England in particular, has all sorts of different sources. Um, in terms of individual travelers, if you have to read just one, read William of Rubruck, which this late medieval mendicant traveler who goes all the way to the capital of the Mongols, which is in many ways fulfills what we think a travel account should be. You really see William as a person. You really see him experiencing a totally foreign culture and bringing back lessons of what he's seen. Um, Benjamin of Tudela is very good as a Jewish traveler from the Middle Ages who gives a very broad perspective of what Jewish life is like in the medieval period in all the different places, a sort of census of Jewish life. And in terms of Muslim sources, Ibn Battuta is the one that, and there's a free translation you can find online, Har Gib, and is definitely worth reading. And in many ways, it's one of the largest travel logs in the Middle Ages. Battuta did not let the grass grow under his feet. He was traveling constantly. So in terms of secondary works, one place to start, the Cambridge History of Travel Writing, which is actually even beyond just the medieval period, is very good just to start with research. If I were to read one monograph, Shane Aaron Lagasse's The Medieval Invention of Travel is very good. It's definitely worth investigating. And two recent collections, Travels and Mobilities in the Middle Ages and Journeying Along Medieval Routes in Europe and the Middle East are two that I would recommend, although there are others. I mean, studies into medieval literature is a very slowly growing field. I would not be surprised if in forthcoming years we'll see more and more work coming out as people begin to realize this is a fascinating subject. So, and my reader was in essence intended to give people sort of an entree into this, what's out there, what kind of sources are there, but there's a lot more beyond what I could include. There's a lot more to be discovered.
Dr. Romano, thank you so much for joining with us today.
Of course, it was good to speak with you.